The October Revolution of 1917 promised the Russian people freedom, bread, and peace. Lenin and his Bolsheviks stood before the masses as liberators who would end centuries of Tsarist oppression. But within a year, that promise curdled into a reign of fear that would come to be known as the Red Terror. The revolution had toppled the Tsar, but it did not bring calm. Civil war erupted, pitting the Bolsheviks against the White Army, monarchists, foreign invaders, and countless factions who saw Lenin's new regime as illegitimate. Survival for the young Soviet state became the excuse for the rise of extraordinary violence. Lenin declared that the revolution could only be defended through ruthless measures. He insisted that mercy was a weakness and that the enemies of the Bolsheviks deserved only destruction. This ideology soon found an iron arm in the form of the Cheka, the Soviet secret police. The Cheka, founded in December 1917 under Felix Dzerzhinsky, became the embodiment of the new terror. Its agents were given unlimited powers to arrest, interrogate, torture, and execute anyone deemed counter-revolutionary. The vague definition meant anyone, from noblemen to priests, peasants, or even workers, could be targeted. The first headquarters of the Cheka sat in the heart of Moscow at Lubyanka. Once an insurance company's grand building, it was transformed into a dungeon of screams and shadows. Prisoners were dragged into its cellars, where torture was not just common, but systematized. Rumors spread quickly of what happened inside those walls. Some captives were forced to stand for hours in ice-cold water, their legs slowly numbing until they collapsed. Others were beaten with iron rods or burned with heated metal. Sleep deprivation became another favorite method, breaking minds without leaving marks. Executions became spectacles of warning. Victims were shot in courtyards, sometimes in groups, their bodies left for hours as examples of the fate awaiting traitors. In some provinces, prisoners were drowned en masse, tied together and thrown into rivers beneath the ice. The terror was not hidden, it was deliberate. Bolshevik newspapers announced mass shootings as though they were proud achievements. Lenin himself approved of the propaganda, urging that terror was not only necessary but revolutionary in itself. He believed fear was the only tool strong enough to bend a fractured Russia into submission. Ordinary Russians quickly learned that suspicion alone could mean death. A careless joke about the government, a rumor of disloyalty, or even refusing to hand over grain to Bolshevik requisition squads could earn the label of counter-revolutionary. Once branded, there was no escape. Families were torn apart as fathers vanished in the night, never to be seen again. Mothers whispered warnings to their children, teaching them never to repeat what was said at home. A culture of silence grew, where every conversation could be overheard, and every neighbor could be an informer. In towns across Russia, Cheka branches replicated the cruelty of Moscow. In Kharkov, prisoners were skinned alive. In Odessa, entire groups were executed by being forced into barrels studded with nails and rolled until their bodies were shredded. In other cities, captives were locked in cages with starving rats. These stories spread like wildfire, both terrifying and numbing the population. Many refused to believe them at first, but soon the sound of gunfire at night and the absence of familiar faces confirmed the truth. Terror was not an exception. It was the system. The Bolsheviks justified their actions by pointing to the civil war raging outside. The whites executed Bolsheviks in their own brutal campaigns, and foreign armies threatened to intervene. Lenin argued that only the most pitiless violence could guarantee survival. But in practice, the Red Terror became a tool of domination over ordinary people. By late 1918, the Red Terror had claimed tens of thousands of lives. Some estimates suggest that within the first 2 years alone, more than 200,000 were executed or tortured. And yet the numbers tell only part of the story. The psychological scars of fear reached millions more. Villages emptied as peasants fled into forests to escape requisition squads. Cities grew hushed at night, the streets filled only with soldiers and agents. A heavy atmosphere of dread settled over Russia, where every knock at the door after dusk could mean disappearance. Lenin wrote openly that revolutionary terror was essential to success. His speeches were filled with words of steel, demanding blood for betrayal and swift punishment for resistance. To him, the cruelty of the Cheka was not excess, it was loyalty to the revolution. Inside the Lubyanka, prisoners scratched final prayers into the walls, knowing their fate was sealed. Guards joked and smoked cigarettes as executions were carried out, their work routine in its efficiency. The line between duty and sadism blurred, until cruelty became a daily rhythm. Even some Bolsheviks themselves grew uneasy. Reports filtered back to party officials describing unimaginable brutality. But dissent within the party was dangerous. Questioning the terror meant aligning with enemies, and so silence prevailed. The Red Terror was not a sudden storm. It was a calculated policy. Every act of torture and every bullet fired into the back of a prisoner's head was part of a machine carefully built to instill obedience. Lenin and the Bolsheviks were reshaping Russia through fear. As the revolution tightened its grip, the Cheka expanded into every corner of the Soviet state. What began in Moscow soon spread across provinces, villages, and battlefronts. No region was free from its shadow, and no person was too small to escape suspicion. The Red Terror had begun as a weapon to protect the revolution, but by the end of its first year, it had become something darker, a permanent instrument of control, a way to bend millions to the will of a small ruling elite. By 1919, Russia had become a battlefield of chaos. Civil war raged across its vast lands, with the Bolsheviks fighting the White Army, foreign invaders, and nationalist movements. The country was fractured, starving, and bleeding. But instead of easing the suffering, the Red Terror only intensified, spreading like wildfire into every village and town. The Cheka, no longer a small secret police force, had grown into a nationwide apparatus of terror. Regional branches sprouted everywhere, each one competing to prove its loyalty to Lenin through harsher methods of repression. The dungeons of Lubyanka in Moscow were now mirrored in provincial basements and abandoned warehouses. Executions became routine. Entire trainloads of prisoners were transported to remote fields, where pits were dug and lined with bodies. Sometimes the Cheka spared bullets by bludgeoning captives to death with clubs, or pushing them into rivers under ice. In cities like Kiev and Kharkov, nightly gunfire echoed so often that people stopped counting the dead. Food shortages fueled resentment against the regime. Peasants who resisted handing over grain were branded as gulags, enemies of the revolution. When villages refused requisition orders, Cheka units stormed in with rifles, seizing crops, slaughtering livestock, and executing farmers as examples. Hunger became a weapon of obedience. In Ukraine, resistance grew fierce, with peasants rising in revolt. The Cheka answered with unmatched cruelty. Families of suspected rebels were rounded up, women and children included, and shot without trial. Entire villages were burned to the ground. Survivors were left with nothing but ashes, forced into submission by fear of annihilation. The prisons overflowed with suspects, many of whom had committed no crime beyond voicing doubts or being born into the wrong class. Aristocrats were hunted relentlessly. Nobles were executed in basements, sometimes after mock trials where the outcome was predetermined. Former officers of the Tsarist army faced summary shootings, even if they had pledged loyalty to the new regime. Clergymen were another prime target. The Orthodox Church, once a pillar of Russian life, was declared an enemy of the people. Priests were hanged from church doors, their bodies left dangling as grotesque warnings. Others were buried alive, their cries muffled beneath the earth. Icons were smashed and sacred places turned into prisons or stables. The brutality was not limited to elites. Ordinary workers, once celebrated as the backbone of the revolution, soon felt the Cheka's wrath. Strikes were outlawed, and anyone who protested low rations or harsh conditions faced arrest. Workers who dared to organize against the Bolsheviks were executed, proving that even the revolution's supposed champions were expendable. Propaganda painted every act of terror as righteous justice. Newspapers celebrated executions with triumphant headlines, listing names of the shot as though they were trophies. The language of cleansing and purging became routine, normalizing violence until the killing of fellow citizens felt like a patriotic duty. The methods of torture grew more grotesque with each passing month. Victims were scalped alive, boiled in cauldrons, or mutilated before being executed. Some were locked in iron cages with wild animals, torn apart for the amusement of their captors. The cruelty was both systematic and creative, designed not only to kill but to terrify. Fear seeped into daily life. Families whispered in candlelight, terrified that careless words might reach an informer. Children were taught to stay silent in school, where teachers often doubled as spies for the regime. The atmosphere of suspicion grew so thick that trust itself became a casualty of the revolution. Lenin, far from denying the bloodshed, endorsed it openly. In speeches and writings, he insisted that terror was not a temporary measure, but a necessary instrument of class war. He mocked those who demanded mercy, declaring that revolutions were never gentle. For him, every bullet and every noose was proof of progress. The numbers of the dead swelled into the tens of thousands, though exact figures were impossible to calculate. Some historians suggest that by 1921, more than 200,000 people had been executed or perished in Cheka prisons. Each statistic represented a life extinguished, yet the regime saw them only as enemies eliminated. Peasant uprisings spread like sparks across the countryside, and each one was crushed with unrelenting ferocity. In Tambov, rebels who resisted Bolshevik requisition squads faced chemical weapons and mass executions. Entire villages were encircled, their inhabitants slaughtered or deported to labor camps. Survival meant submission, and even that was no guarantee of safety. Cities, too, became graveyards of dissent. In Petrograd, protests against food shortages ended with machine gun fire into crowds. In Moscow, students who distributed anti-Bolshevik pamphlets were dragged into basements and shot. The boundaries between battlefield and civilian life vanished, for everyone was treated as a potential enemy. Foreign observers were horrified. Diplomats and journalists reported on the bloodshed, though their accounts were often dismissed as exaggeration. Some, sympathetic to the revolution, justified the violence as growing pains of a new system. But those who lived in Russia knew the truth. Terror had become the law of the land. Even within Bolshevik ranks, fear grew. Disloyalty, real or imagined, could end in execution. Old comrades who questioned Lenin's policies found themselves denounced as traitors. The revolution devoured its own, with Cheka firing squads turning on men who had once marched under the same red banners. By the early 1920s, the Cheka had become more than an institution. It was a shadow government, answering only to Lenin. Its dungeons stretched across Russia, filled with the moans of prisoners and the echoes of shots in the night. Torture and execution were not aberrations, but the very foundation of its power. The people, once hopeful that the revolution would bring equality and dignity, now lived in constant dread. The dream of liberation was buried beneath corpses, replaced by a nightmare of surveillance, hunger, and death. The Red Terror was no longer a response to civil war. It had become the permanent heartbeat of Soviet rule. By the early 1920s, Russia was no longer the land of fiery slogans and hopeful crowds that had cheered the Bolsheviks in 1917. It was a land of silence, whispers, and dread. The Red Terror, once introduced as a temporary measure to save the revolution, had become the very backbone of Lenin's new Soviet state. The Cheka, born as a revolutionary police force, had evolved into an omnipresent monster. Its network of agents stretched from Moscow to the smallest villages, embedding itself in factories, schools, and military units. To resist the Cheka was suicide. To speak against it was unthinkable. Fear itself had become a form of governance. As the civil war drew to a close, many hoped that the bloodshed would subside. The White armies were defeated, foreign troops withdrew, and Bolshevik rule seemed secure. But instead of easing, the violence deepened. Lenin and his inner circle believed that peace did not mean mercy. It meant an even stronger grip on power. The executions did not stop. Prison basements across Russia still rang with the crack of gunfire. Men and women alike were dragged before firing squads, often without trial. Families never knew what became of their loved ones. They vanished into the maw of the secret police, swallowed by a system that thrived on silence. Torture, once justified as a wartime necessity, became institutional routine. Prisoners were beaten until their bones snapped, starved until their ribs pierced the skin, or left in freezing cells until frostbite consumed their limbs. In some regions, victims were mutilated before being executed, their corpses displayed as lessons for the living. Labor camps emerged as another arm of terror. Prisoners who were not executed outright were sent to harsh camps in the north and east, where endless forests and icy wastelands became their cages. There, men and women worked to exhaustion, cutting timber, mining, or building roads with little food and no medical care. The seeds of the gulag system, later perfected under Stalin, were planted in this period. Lenin's government understood that forced labor not only punished dissenters, but also exploited them for economic survival. In the freezing winds of Siberia, political prisoners labored until death, their suffering hidden far from the eyes of the cities. The famine of 1921 struck with devastating force, killing millions. Crops failed, but grain requisitioning continued, as Bolshevik squads seized food to feed the cities and the Red Army. Desperate peasants ate grass, bark, and sometimes even the flesh of the dead. Instead of easing their burden, the Cheka punished those accused of hoarding or resisting, executing countless villagers. Lenin saw famine not only as a tragedy, but also as an opportunity. Starvation weakened peasant resistance, ensuring that uprisings could not take root. Grain became a weapon, distributed only to those loyal to the party. For the disobedient, hunger was the punishment. The Orthodox Church faced near destruction. Lenin ordered campaigns to strip churches of valuables, supposedly to fund famine relief, but in reality to crush the influence of religion. Priests who resisted were executed, churches demolished, icons burned. Faith itself became a crime against the state, punishable by death. Resistance flickered here and there. In Kronstadt, sailors who had once supported the Bolsheviks rose in rebellion, demanding freedom, fair rations, and the end of terror. Lenin responded with overwhelming force, sending the Red Army to storm the naval base. Thousands of rebels were slaughtered, and survivors were executed or sent to labor camps. The Kronstadt rebellion was a clear message. Even the revolution's earliest supporters were not safe. No loyalty was permanent, and no forgiveness existed. The Bolshevik state devoured its own children, proving that terror was not a phase, but a permanent creed. By 1922, the Cheka had grown so powerful that even Lenin feared its independence. To tighten control, it was renamed the GPU and placed under closer supervision, but its methods remained unchanged. Torture chambers, firing squads, and forced labor continued. Only the name on the letterhead was different. Intellectuals and writers also fell victim. Those who criticized the regime, even gently, were silenced. Some were executed, others fled into exile, and many remained, writing cautiously under the watchful eyes of censors. Russian culture itself bent beneath the weight of fear, reshaped to serve the revolution. Ordinary people adapted to survive. Families avoided speaking of politics at dinner. Neighbors avoided eye contact in case a glance was misread as disloyalty. Children grew up learning that silence was safety, and loyalty to the party was life. Terror had seeped so deeply into the fabric of society that it became invisible, an unquestioned reality. Lenin, increasingly ill by 1922, still defended the violence. In his writings, he mocked those who called the terror excessive, insisting that without it, the revolution would have collapsed. To him, rivers of blood were not evidence of failure, but proof of strength. The toll of the Red Terror was staggering. Estimates vary, but historians believe hundreds of thousands were executed, while millions more suffered imprisonment, torture, or forced labor. The psychological toll, however, was immeasurable. A nation taught to fear, to obey, to accept cruelty as ordinary life. Even as Lenin's health declined, the machinery of repression did not falter. It was no longer dependent on his orders alone. The terror had become institutionalized, embedded in the Soviet state like steel beams in a building. Whoever succeeded Lenin would inherit not just a government, but a weaponized system of fear. That successor would be Joseph Stalin, a man who studied Lenin's methods closely and prepared to expand them to unprecedented levels. The Cheka's dungeons would evolve into the vast Gulag Empire. The mass executions of the early 1920s would become the great purges of the 1930s. Lenin had opened the door, and Stalin would march through it with even more ruthless determination. By the time Lenin died in 1924, Russia had been permanently scarred. The promises of liberation, equality, and dignity had drowned in blood and tears. The Red Terror had reshaped the nation, teaching its people that mercy was weakness and survival depended on silence.